The Second Crusade has failed, but its end will open the door to the Plantagenets, that brilliant, avaricious, rebellious, murderous family that will dominate the history of Western Europe for a century to come. Here's their story, so riveting that we still are fascinated by it 900 years later.
Welcome back to Lion's Forge. My name is Becket, and I want to tell you a story, an epic, true story of 5 kings and the Lion Queen. Season 2, Episode 9. Who is this worldly man of God? The revered Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald, had died, leaving the richest and most powerful church office in Britain vacant. Henry thought about it as he thought about everything, with an eye on the main chance for the Plantagenets' ambitions. A year passed amiably enough. The spring of 1162 found Henry's family and royal court in Falaise, amid Normandy's scented apple orchards, 40 miles from the coast. William the Conqueror had been born there, a place dominated by the truly formidable fortress castle of the Dukes of Normandy. Henry, who 2 years before had rushed toddlers, his son and Louis Capet's daughter, off to a very hasty wedding, let an entire year go by without doing a thing about the vacancy in Canterbury. As usual, there was a reason: money. When a bishop died, revenues from his church estates flowed into the king's hands until a successor was named, creating little incentive to find one too quickly. Canterbury had once sat vacant for 5 years. King Henry had instead busied himself in other ways. Eleanor, 40 years old by now, was expecting her 8th child. Well rested from his year of little else going on, no invasions, no wars, no great councils, no treks across open seas, Henry finally sent out waves of couriers on fast horses. He wanted his Chancellor, Thomas Becket, to take the Plantagenet heir, Prince Henry, now aged 7, back to England, where every noble and bishop was to appear and swear fealty to the boy. Henry also wanted something else. He announced, with entire confidence in the outcome, that he intended Chancellor Thomas Becket to take up the additional office of Archbishop of Canterbury. It's a rare position in the Western world in our day that would equal the power, authority, and prestige accompanying this startling proposal. There's no solidly accepted rationale as to why Henry made this choice, given the sharp words between king and chancellor in the wake of the Toulouse debacle. Maybe he still trusted Becket more than he could trust anyone else. Maybe he knew of no one else with Becket's vast array of skills. Maybe he simply wanted to prove again that whatever he might want would indeed be what he got. If Henry expected his sparkling idea to be greeted with delight, he must have sulked mightily at the actual outcome. Aside from Henry, no one cared for it. To begin with, this intended prince of the church wasn't even a priest, much less a man renowned for his holiness. While we automatically think of the martyred saint, in 1162, Becket was known for the lavish spectacle of his entirely worldly life, a life which had recently included a turn as a sword-wielding warrior in Toulouse. And Thomas Becket was still Chancellor of England, Henry's creature in terms of politics. There was no precedent for the combined office except in Germany, which wasn't commonly thought a model for English behavior. Some stories maintain that Eleanor, and even Henry's mother Matilda, who herself had been raised at the German court, let it be publicly known that they were appalled. Becket himself didn't want the job, something he repeatedly made clear to his dear friend the king. As for the English clergy, it was openly sullen, something of a problem, one would think, since the monks of Canterbury traditionally elected their archbishop. The only man in England who wanted Thomas Becket to be the Archbishop of Canterbury was Henry Plantagenet. One must say it was a splendid time to be a king. You were fairly certain to get what you wanted. Elderly, respected Richard de Lucy was assigned the thankless job of cajoling the monks of Canterbury to vote the right way. According to contemporary accounts, de Lucy leaned rather heavily on the concept that the king should be made happy. It can't be said that the idea was unique to this situation. There's an old document apparently written by Henry to the monks at another abbey, which baldly says, quote, "I order you to hold a free election, but I forbid you to elect anyone save Richard, my clerk." Thus, strenuous, not to mention lucid objections succumbed to Henry Plantagenet's bull-headed determination. Unwilling Thomas Becket was unwillingly elected the supreme representative of the Roman Catholic Church in England, hastily ordained as a priest the day before his consecration as archbishop. Getting his way in all things, even if accomplished by tormenting everyone involved, always made Henry happy. He was in such a fine mood after the election that when the Queen was delivered of the newest baby in October, a girl, the king affably agreed to name his infant daughter Eleanor. What no one anticipated was that the new archbishop, renowned primarily for his intimate friendship with Henry and the luxurious life that friendship provided, was about to undergo a spiritual and psychological transformation of astonishing scope. To this day, historians argue about him. The respected chronicler William of Newburgh, looking back on what happened from the perspective of later years, described Thomas as so rapidly and so profoundly changed that only the direct touch of the finger of God could have done it. People have found his life a psychological puzzle ever since. Some think of him as a splendid actor, a man happily playing various roles for an audience fascinated by his hydra-headed personality. W.L. Warren, Henry's biographer, insists that Becket had to find triumph in every setting to feed a monumental ego, while there's another historian who argues instead that Becket was so driven because he was so profoundly insecure. Another assessment is that the new archbishop realized he had to prove himself a serious churchman, given his history, including his coerced election. Simon Schama might have the best analysis that Becket, relying on their history, overestimated his value to Henry, casually assuming that their bond could never be seriously threatened. Yet regardless of Becket's ambition or ego, he hadn't asked to be where he now was, torn between God's world and Henry's. If you act rightly and defend the liberty of the Church, the authority of the king bars the way, warned Becket's friend John of Salisbury, while if you act otherwise, the law of God will cry out against you. Holy Scripture put it more baldly: no man can serve two masters. There was no escaping the trap he was in, the trap Henry had made for his dear friend, whether deliberately or out of simple carelessness. They both saw the trap. Henry simply expected Thomas to find a way to solve it to Henry's satisfaction. Instead, Thomas made the decision that would shape the rest of his life. He was going to put God first. The first volley in the great war to come between Archbishop and King arrived in the form of Becket's abrupt resignation as Chancellor. he returned the Great Seal of England via messenger, sending word that both jobs were too much for one man, an excuse that in no way excused his failure to personally beg the king's permission first. Of course, overwork was not the reason behind the resignation. The insulted king must have instantly understood that Thomas had chewed his own arm off to escape. The new archbishop went even further. It had always been rumored, even among those who wouldn't believe it, that warrior Becket, utterly worldly Becket, that lover of good wine and beautiful horses, wore a penitential hair shirt under his clothes, that awful, galling, chafing garment adopted primarily by saintly monks and remorseful laymen. Now that he had become the archbishop, he was known to continuously wear one that was longer, tighter, forever unwashed. He lashed his bare back with a whip when local priests weren't doing it for him. He starved himself so he could give his food to the poor. He drank foul water as penance, forced himself to lie in icy streams, slept on a bed of planks, unless he had chosen the frigid stone floor instead. 13 beggars pulled off the streets each morning, no doubt stinking to high heaven, watched in confused astonishment as his white hands washed their filthy feet. Most of us are pretty much one kind of person. Thomas Becket somehow managed to fold a dozen competing personalities into his tall, thin frame. Luxury-loving striver, soldier, holy man, royal officer, stiff-necked moralist, arrogant rebel, courageous opponent of tyranny, and martyred saint. He lived them all. Whatever his motives, Thomas quickly became someone Henry Plantagenet would not want in the same room. This archbishop was anything but a grateful retainer. He sped to reclaim properties that long ago had belonged to the church, but which, over the years since the anarchy, had been held by lay nobles who were distinctly irritated to be told they no longer possessed title. He even stretched back to King Stephen's time to claim redress for property taken from Canterbury during those terrible years. Of course, it wasn't lost on anyone that Stephen's successor Henry had tidied up the entire kingdom while somehow proving to be remarkably slow to address Canterbury's entirely legitimate claims. Henry stiffened at this implied rebuke, and then got word that Thomas had excommunicated a nobleman named William of Eynsford over a land dispute. Bishops weren't supposed to excommunicate barons who held their fiefs directly from the king without begging the king's permission first. If all of that was vastly annoying, Henry must have exploded when he opened this parchment from Canterbury. As the lord you are, I ought to and I do offer you my advice and my respect. As the king you are, I am obliged to revere you, but also to admonish you. And as the son you are, because of my office, I am obliged to punish and restrain you. Murmured warnings came from Thomas's peers. Thomas chose to ignore them. There are thoughtful analyses written many years after it all played out that say Becket could and should have handled everything differently, gleaning far better results for the Catholic Church, the country, the king, and himself, if he had only been less stubborn, more pragmatic, less confrontational, more measured. Historians have pointed out that a great many other archbishops, including Thomas's beloved and admired predecessor Theobald, had protected the church without going to war with the monarchy. Thomas simply couldn't do it. To this day, no historian, no biographer entirely captures the reason. Arguably, It was the man's temperament to go at everything hammer and tongs, devil take the hindmost. Perhaps it was a measured decision to follow the will of infallible God rather than the will of a fallible king. Perhaps it was sheer pig-headed competitive stubbornness. Perhaps it was monstrous egotism, swollen to entirely new dimensions now that he spoke directly to the deity. Perhaps it was simmering resentment over being blamed for Toulouse after so many years of wholehearted dedication to Henry's interests. Or perhaps he simply saw himself as free, for the first time in his life, to act as he saw fit, rather than forever constrained to play the role of some other man's lieutenant. Whether it was saintly or stupid depends entirely on your view of open conflict with the most powerful man in Europe. Gilbert Folliot, Bishop of London, respected for both sanctity and intelligence, summarily remarked of the new senior prelate, "An ass he always was, and an ass he'll always be." Certain of Thomas's actions certainly do smack of unsaintly conceit. He declared that the day of his consecration should be a new feast day for public celebration. He insisted on formalities that chafed. He demanded that the Grand Earl of Hertford do personal homage to him for a minor parcel of land. Someone recorded an exasperated Henry, who had made Thomas who he was, asking why Thomas, quote, "felt compelled to oppose me in all things." Replied Thomas with galling smugness, "God, who is the giver of all things, decided to confer them on me through you," a point of view which could not conceivably have soothed the notorious Plantagenet temper. Even the Pope was anxious about the Archbishop's stubborn self-righteousness, urging him to consider more measured dealings with the king. King and Archbishop did not see each other again until 1163, when they met at Southampton. They greeted each other cordially enough, but not a single onlooker missed the king turning his face aside from the customary welcoming kiss of fellowship and peace. That solitary gesture said it all. Henry and Thomas would skirmish incessantly from here on out. Watching them fight over everything now, others felt free to follow their lead. Episodes that would have meant nothing, or never occurred at all, if Thomas had been in Henry's grace, became fraught conflicts over dominance. Just as Henry had done as a new king, Thomas had to assert control over the considerable array of rights and privilege he had inherited upon taking Canterbury. This could be done gently, gracefully. Becket simply couldn't bring himself to heel. His run-in with the Earl of Hertford began with Becket's imperious summons that the great man appear in person to kiss Becket's ring, and this for nothing but a mere slice of real estate held through the church. The Archbishop had the right to homage for the property, but the Earl was a notable personage in his own right, and it would have been more prudent to let the matter lie. Becket wouldn't. For his part, Hertford simply refused, adding impenitently that he was solely answerable to the king. Henry did nothing, letting the Earl thumb his nose, despite knowing full well that even the Pope insisted that bishops were to hold fast to their rights when it came to church property. Courtiers whose lives revolved around gossip and the implication of gossip repeated and embellished every tidbit. The two camps became increasingly heated and increasingly estranged. They clashed openly at a council held that summer at a royal hunting lodge turned summer palace called Woodstock, a year into Thomas's tenure as archbishop. Henry, most certainly with Thomas's advice and assistance in the old days, had begun to shift his kingdom away from the ancient obligation that vassals were to provide so many days of annual military service to their king. Henry preferred more efficient modern solutions. One of the best, from the king's perspective, was the substitution of money for personal service. Money in the form of regularized, faithfully recorded annual taxes. Tax money could be converted into all kinds of useful things, including castles, allies, and, best of all, mercenaries who were free of competing obligations that might see the clock run out on their commitment before a war was won. Even more to the point, mercenary armies weren't limited by the procreative diligence of the local populace. If you had the money, you could buy, build, or hire virtually any weapon, any fortification, any size army you wanted. And the bigger and better equipped the army, the more impossible it would be to stand against it. Thus, always on the hunt for new ways to raise ever more cash, Henry used the 1163 Woodstock Council to propose that an old property tax called the sheriff's stipend be sent to the royal treasury rather than remitted to the local sheriffs, as had long been customary. There might have been some rustling on the benches as he described this novel idea, but the one who spoke was Becket. He said the change was unjustified, and the Canterbury estates were not going to do it. No one else opened his mouth except Henry, who probably turned purple before reportedly yelling, "By God's eyes, it shall be given over as revenue!" Thomas's objection was unreasonable on its face. His opposition had nothing to do with some new tax, but only where existing revenue should go, something that had no effect whatever on the church. Henry Plantagenet undoubtedly saw his archbishop's rebellion as little more than arbitrary grandstanding, and Henry was not a patient, kindly man. In Henry's mind, Thomas should have felt indebted to his mighty patron for years of privileged favor. Instead, the damnable upstart had the gall to bite down on the hand that had raised him up every rung on the ladder. Henry was known to be angry, but for the moment he swallowed his infamous temper. There was a far bigger battle looming with the archbishop. The inflammatory topic of lawlessness across the kingdom, in particular lawlessness attributed to what were called criminous clerks. These were men who at some time or other had taken low-end holy orders, then turned robber, thug, rapist, even murderer. Thanks to their passing relationship with the church, they could look to the church's private law courts when they got into trouble, placing themselves safely outside the more severe king's justice that applied to everyone else. The problem was bad and getting worse. According to the chronicler William of Newburgh, during Henry's reign, more than 100 murders had been committed by clergymen in England. It's not a vast surprise, given the growing need for educated government officials to staff Henry's realm, since most educated men of the day came through the church. More and more of them meant greater likelihood that some would be bad apples. It was a genuine scandal to Henry, a serious-minded king who wanted an orderly kingdom. He wasn't the only one outraged. Men who had taken even the pettiest religious vows faced little but a comparative slap on the wrist, even if convicted of terrible crimes. The worst punishments possible in the ecclesiastical legal system were banishment or defrocking, while the king's courts could order death. Henry could look to a typical case of the day involving a minor churchman named Philip de Broye, accused of murdering a knight. De Broye claimed his right to trial in the Bishop of Lincoln's court, relying on the defense of purgation, an ancient ritual where an accused in a religious court swore his innocence and had 12 others swear as well. In the church's view, to swear to a lie meant eternal damnation for the sin of perjury, so certainly anyone willing to so swear could not be guilty. De Broye was accordingly acquitted, an outcome which appalled the king's local justice, powerless in the case. There were sadly a great many de Broys in the kingdom, but the bishops' collective response had been to look away, doing very little to toughen their own courts or cooperate more willingly with the king's. As far back as the 1090s, 2 generations earlier, that era's Archbishop of Canterbury had famously fought with that era's king over how much power the king's courts had over the clergy. Staving off outright war between church and state had meant many delicate negotiations over the years. Now, the tacit agreement to let careful compromise head off frightening crisis was breaking down under the intensity of the personal struggle between Thomas and Henry. The pot was heating. After simmering throughout 1163 as king and archbishop argued back and forth, it would boil over the following year. Anno Domini 1164 began with a January report from an abbot near Paris that nature was badly disordered. 3 circles and 2 suns seen in the sky, and a dragon of immense size so close to the earth, houses burned. If Henry heard of this awful sighting, it didn't stop him from calling a new council of nobles and bishops. The setting was to be Clarendon, another royal hunting lodge, this one in the midst of the hills, rivers, sheep farms, and ancient places of Wiltshire, which we now know best as the site of Stonehenge. The insufferable behavior of so many criminous clerks and the church's refusal to turn them over to secular justice were items 1 and 2 on the agenda. But the coming fight between Henry and Thomas ultimately was over the question whether Becket or the king ruled in England. It was a battle which frightened even the Pope, beleaguered Alexander III, who pleaded with Becket to make peace. And it was a battle which, all too soon, would endanger lives and souls across the Plantagenet world. We've come to the end of our story for the time being. I am Becket Arnold, narrating from the book Lion's Forge, adapted for us by the author Karen Markle-Knapp. Thank you to Francis Butt for voicing our introduction. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating, follow our channel, and share us with your friends. Most importantly, please join us again April 1st for the next episode of Lion's Forge, available everywhere you get your favorite podcasts, including on YouTube with video episode trailers. Visit us on Facebook, where you can ask questions, leave reviews, and interact with me. Until next time, thank you for listening.